Ridiculed and dismissed as the family outcast, an impoverished orphan inherited nothing but 70 acres of useless, rock-choked wasteland. The wealthy relatives sneered at his misfortune, celebrating their own lucrative windfalls. They stopped laughing, however, when a mysterious sinkhole swallowed a tractor, revealing a secret that changed history forever. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrison and Caldwell law firm in downtown Pittsburgh, mirroring the bleakness settling in Alfred Horton's chest. The mahogany conference room smelled of expensive leather, aged scotch, and the overpowering floral perfume of his aunt, Beatrice Hayes. Alfred sat rigidly in a corner chair, acutely aware of the grease stains permanently etched into the cuticles of his hands. He was a mechanic by trade, 24 years old, and entirely out of place among the tailored suits and glittering jewelry of his extended family. At the head of the table sat Richard Caldwell, a lawyer with a face as weathered as old parchment. He cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he smoothed out the final will and testament of Silas Horton. Silas, Alfred's grandfather, had been a ruthless industrialist, a man who amassed a fortune in steel and logistics during the mid-20th century. He was also a man who had completely severed ties with Alfred after Alfred's parents perished in a tragic bridge collapse when the boy was only 6. Instead of taking his orphaned grandson in, Silas had shipped him off to the foster system, sending nothing more than a token birthday card containing a crisp $10 bill once a year. "We now come to the distribution of the primary estate," Caldwell announced, his voice devoid of emotion. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with unconcealed greed. Beside her, Thomas Sterling, Beatrice's son and a ruthless real estate developer in his own right, tapped a gold pen impatiently against a legal pad. "To my daughter, Beatrice Hayes, I leave the entirety of the Horton Trust, including the liquid assets held in the Cayman accounts and the residential estate in Fox Chapel," Caldwell read. Beatrice let out a breath she had been holding, a triumphant smile stretching across her heavily powdered face. She didn't even glance in Alfred's direction. "To my grandson, Thomas Sterling, I leave the commercial property portfolio, encompassing the downtown office, high-rises, and the waterfront development rights," Caldwell continued. Thomas smirked, leaning back and crossing his arms. He had already begun calculating the liquidation value in his head. The Horton Empire had just been cleaved in two, handed to the vultures who had hovered around Silas's deathbed for the past 5 years. Caldwell paused, looking down at the document, then briefly looked up, offering Alfred a fleeting glance of profound pity. And finally, "To my estranged grandson, Alfred Horton." The room grew dead silent. Beatrice raised an eyebrow, while Thomas snorted quietly. Alfred tightened his grip on the armrests of his chair. He hadn't expected a dime. He had only come because the law firm had threatened to send marshals to his apartment if he didn't attend the mandatory reading. "To Alfred, I leave the deed to the 70-acre property situated in Blackwood County, locally recorded as Dead Creek Ridge." Caldwell lowered the paper. "That concludes the distributions." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then, Thomas burst into a loud, braying laugh. Beatrice quickly joined him, her laughter sharp and condescending. "Dead Creek Ridge?" Thomas choked out, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "Are you serious, Richard? The old man gave him the boneyard." "It is a legally binding transfer," Caldwell said stiffly. Alfred felt a flush of humiliation creep up his neck. "What is Dead Creek Ridge?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's a toxic wasteland, Alfred," Beatrice said, turning to him with a look of mock sympathy that was worse than outright hatred. "It's 70 acres of barren limestone, sinkholes and dead scrub brush up in the mountains. Nothing grows there. You can't build on it because the bedrock is unstable. Silas bought it for pennies in the 70s, thinking there was a coal seam under it. There wasn't. It's entirely worthless. Worse than worthless, Thomas chimed in, tossing his gold pen onto the table. The county has been threatening to reclassify it as a hazardous runoff zone. The annual property taxes are nearly $4,000. Congratulations, cousin. Grandfather didn't just leave you nothing. He left you a financial liability. Alfred stared at the thick, embossed envelope Caldwell slid across the table toward him. It contained the deed. It represented the sum total of his inheritance from a family that had thrown him away like garbage. If you're smart, you'll let it default to the county, Thomas said, standing up and buttoning his bespoke suit jacket. Or out of the goodness of my heart, I'll take it off your hands for $500. I need a place to dump crushed concrete from my demolition sites anyway. Alfred looked from the smirking face of his cousin to the cold, dismissive eyes of his aunt. He thought of his parents, who had died with nothing, and the years he had spent wearing hand-me-down clothes in overcrowded foster homes. Pride, hot and defiant, flared in his chest. He stood up, snatched the heavy envelope off the table, and shoved it into the pocket of his worn jacket. "Keep your money, Thomas. The land is mine." Beatrice laughed again, as Alfred walked toward the heavy oak doors. "Enjoy your dirt, Alfred. Don't forget to pay the tax man." The mocking laughter echoed in the hallway, long after the doors swung shut. Alfred walked out into the Pittsburgh rain, the deed burning a hole in his pocket. He was broke, behind on his rent, and had just acquired 70 acres of useless rock. But it was his rock, and he was going to find out exactly what the old man had dumped on him. 2 weeks later, Alfred stood at the edge of Dead Creek Ridge. Beatrice hadn't exaggerated. The landscape was aggressively bleak. Jagged spires of grey limestone thrust out of the earth like broken teeth, surrounded by dense, thorny brambles and stunted, dying pine trees. The ground was uneven, scarred by deep ravines and treacherous, sudden drops. The air smelled faintly of sulphur and decaying leaves. It was a desolate, hostile place. Yet, as Alfred walked the perimeter, fighting his way through the heavy brush, a strange sense of ownership washed over him. Nobody was going to kick him off this land. Nobody was going to tell him what to do here. His plan was born of pure desperation. To pay the impending property taxes, he needed cash. He had spoken to Big Jim Reynolds, his gruff but kind-hearted boss at the auto garage. Jim had mentioned that old mining and logging camps from the 1920s often left behind valuable scrap iron, copper wire, and sometimes antique machinery that collectors would pay good money for. Armed with a cheap, second-hand metal detector and a rusted machete, Alfred spent his weekends meticulously sweeping the miserable terrain. For the first month, he found nothing but old tin cans, rusted hunting traps, and shotgun shells. The financial pressure was mounting. Thomas Sterling had somehow found out about Alfred's attempts to clear the land and had begun a campaign of bureaucratic harassment. Alfred received notices from the county zoning board, undoubtedly prompted by Thomas's political connections, threatening fines for uncleared debris and unsafe topographical conditions. Thomas was trying to bleed him dry, forcing him to sell the land for pennies just for the sadistic pleasure of it. But Alfred was stubborn. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late August, having taken a week of unpaid leave from the garage, he was working the northernmost ridge of the property. The metal detector had been silent all morning. He was dehydrated, covered in tick bites, and nursing bleeding blisters on his palms. He swung the detector over a slight depression in the earth, shaded by a massive dead oak tree. The machine shrieked. It wasn't the weak, stuttering beep of a tin can. It was a solid, continuous howl, indicating a massive metallic density just beneath the surface. Alfred dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp rocks tearing at his jeans. He grabbed his folding trench shovel and began to dig. The soil here was strangely loose, unlike the clay-heavy dirt elsewhere on the ridge. 2 feet down, his shovel struck something hard. A metallic clank echoed in the quiet woods. He frantically cleared the dirt away with his bare hands. It wasn't a piece of scrap. It was a thick, industrial steel grate, heavily oxidized but completely intact. Alfred sat back, wiping a mixture of sweat and mud from his forehead. A grate meant ventilation. Ventilation meant something was buried underneath. He spent the next 3 days calling in the biggest favor of his life. He convinced Big Jim to lend him the garage's beat-up diesel backhoe, hauling it up the treacherous mountain road on a flatbed trailer. He also enlisted the help of Samuel O'Connor, a retired county geological surveyor who had been good friends with Alfred's father before the accident. Sam was 70 years old, possessed a mind like a steel trap, and hated the Horton establishment as much as Alfred did. I pulled every topographical map and mining registry for this county dating back to 1890, Sam said, unrolling a set of faded blueprints on the hood of Alfred's truck as the backhoe idled nearby. There is absolutely no record of a mine, a military bunker, or a commercial basement on this ridge. Whatever is down there, it was built off the books, completely black market. Then let's find out what my grandfather was hiding, Alfred said, climbing into the cab of the backhoe. The excavation was grueling. They worked in absolute secrecy, covering the machinery with camouflage tarps at night to avoid any aerial surveillance Thomas might employ. The backhoe tore through the rocky soil, widening the hole around the ventilation grate. On the 4th day, the earth gave way. The backhoe's bucket scraped against a massive, flat surface. Alfred killed the engine, and the 2 men climbed down into the massive crater they had dug. Before them lay a sprawling slab of reinforced concrete, poured thick and designed to withstand immense pressure. Extending from the concrete was a vertical bulkhead, leading down into the earth like the entrance to a subterranean fortress. At the center of the bulkhead was a door. It was made of solid, forged steel, easily 10 inches thick, resembling the door of a bank vault. A massive wheel handle sat in the center, locked tight by a heavy combination dial that had been welded shut. "Lord Almighty," Sam whispered, shining his heavy-duty flashlight over the rusted surface. "Alfred, this isn't a root cellar. This is a blast door. They used these in the 1950s for nuclear fallout shelters, but this concrete pour, this looks older. Much older." Alfred ran his hand over the cold steel. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Silas Horton hadn't bought this land thinking there was coal. He had bought it to hide something. And he had left it to the grandson he hated, perhaps as a final, cruel joke, assuming Alfred would never have the resources or the spine to actually investigate the worthless property. "Can we get in?" Alfred asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sam adjusted his hard hat. "Not with a shovel. We're going to need an industrial oxyacetylene cutting torch, an angle grinder, and about 3 days of continuous labor. If we cut the hinges and burn out the locking pins, we might be able to drag the door open with the backhoe." They bought the equipment using the absolute last of Alfred's savings. His bank account was overdrawn. He was living on canned beans and instant coffee. If this turned out to be an empty concrete box, he was completely, irreversibly ruined. The cutting process was a nightmare of noise, heat, and flying sparks. Alfred wore heavy welding gear, the torch spitting white-hot fire as it slowly, agonizingly chewed through the hardened steel hinges. It took an entire weekend. The smell of vaporized metal and ancient dust filled the crater. By Sunday evening, the final locking pin gave way with a loud metallic crack that echoed across the desolate ridge. Alfred attached heavy logging chains from the vault door's wheel to the bucket of the backhoe. He climbed into the cab, his hands trembling on the controls. Sam stood back at a safe distance, giving a thumbs up. Alfred engaged the hydraulics. The diesel engine roared, belching black smoke into the twilight air. The chains pulled taut, singing with tension. For a terrifying 10 seconds, nothing happened. The backhoe's tracks spun in the dirt, struggling for traction. Then, a deep, resonant groan echoed from the earth. The seal broke. With a sickening screech of tearing metal, the massive steel door was wrenched outward, crashing onto the dirt with a force that shook the ground. A rush of perfectly preserved, incredibly dry air blasted out of the darkness, carrying an unmistakable scent, a mixture of old machine oil, leather, and aged paper. Alfred killed the engine and scrambled down into the crater. Sam was already at the entrance, his high-powered flashlight piercing the Stygian gloom of the tunnel. "Alfred," Sam breathed, his voice trembling in a way the younger man had never heard before. "You need to see this." Alfred stepped up to the threshold, peering over Sam's shoulder into the cavernous space beyond. As the beam of the flashlight swept across the vast, concrete-lined subterranean chamber, Alfred's breath caught in his throat. The mockery of the will, the harassment from Thomas, the years of poverty. None of it mattered anymore. Beneath the barren dirt of Dead Creek Ridge lay a fortune so immense it defied comprehension. Deep within the cavernous bunker, the air remained unnervingly still. Samuel swept his high-powered flashlight across the expansive room, the beam catching on rows of immaculate, reflective surfaces. Alfred stepped cautiously over the steel threshold, his boots echoing sharply off the reinforced concrete floor. The space was the size of a commercial airplane hangar, meticulously climate-controlled by a passive geothermal system that had quietly functioned for decades. Sitting in perfect, staggered rows were automobiles. But these were not just any cars. They were the holy grails of automotive history, preserved in absolute, pristine condition beneath heavy canvas tarps that had rotted away at the edges. Alfred's mechanical background kicked in, his jaw dropping as he walked past the silent leviathans. He pulled the fabric back off the closest vehicle. The flashlight illuminated the sweeping, elegant fenders of a 1935 Duesenberg SSJ. Moving to the next, he uncovered a 1937 Mercedes-Benz 5.4 OK Special Roadster, its chrome detailing practically blinding in the harsh light. Further back sat a legendary 1938 Alfa Romeo 8C 2900B. There were over 20 vehicles in total, a collection easily worth hundreds of millions of dollars on the modern auction block. Silas Horton had not just collected cars, he had hoarded the finest automotive masterpieces of the pre-war era, hiding them away from the world. "Mercy," Samuel whispered, leaning heavily against the fender of a perfectly preserved Aston Martin. He bought them. During the Great Depression and the rationing of the wars, Silas was buying up European and American masterpieces for pennies on the dollar, from desperate aristocrats and ruined industrialists. He buried them here. But the cars were only half of the secret. At the far end of the vault sat a heavy mahogany desk, completely out of place in the industrial bunker. Behind it stood a wall of heavy iron filing cabinets. Alfred approached the desk. Resting on the pristine blotter was a brass-cornered ledger and a sealed envelope bearing Alfred's name. Alfred's hands shook as he broke the wax seal. The letter inside was written in Silas's sharp, spidery handwriting. "Alfred, if you are reading this, It means you did not sell the ridge to your greedy aunt and cousin. It means you possessed the grit your father had. The grit I foolishly mistook for rebellion. The empire I built above ground, the trusts, the real estate, the Cayman accounts, is a house of cards built on extortion, bribery, and the theft of municipal funds during the post-war industrial boom. I knew the federal government would eventually come looking for the discrepancies. Beatrice and Thomas care only for the illusion of wealth. I left them the poisoned fruit. The evidence of my financial sins is in these cabinets. The cars, however, were purchased legally with my earliest, legitimate fortunes. They are clean, and they are yours. You have the deed to the land, and therefore all subterranean rights and contents. Do what you will." Alfred stared at the letter, a heavy, profound silence settling over him. Silas hadn't left him a toxic wasteland. He had left him the only clean assets the Horton family possessed, alongside the detonator to destroy the corrupt empire his aunt and cousin had just inherited. "Alfred!" Samuel's voice barked from the tunnel entrance, shattering the quiet. "We've got company!" Alfred shoved the letter and the ledger into his jacket and sprinted toward the blast door. As he climbed up the makeshift dirt ramp and emerged from the crater, the rhythmic, deafening thumping of helicopter rotors assaulted his ears. A sleek, black corporate helicopter was circling low over the tree line, its side door open. A photographer was leaning out, snapping rapid-fire pictures of the backhoe, the excavated crater, and the massive steel blast door. Thomas Sterling had been watching. Less than 3 hours later, the private road leading up to Dead Creek Ridge was choked with luxury SUVs and a squad car belonging to the Blackwood County Sheriff. Thomas practically leaped out of his Range Rover, his face a mask of furious, greedy realization. Behind him stepped Beatrice, shielding her eyes from the sun, and Sheriff Miller, a man whose election campaigns were heavily funded by Thomas's real estate firm. "Step away from the crater, Alfred," Thomas shouted, pointing a manicured finger at the excavation site. "By order of the Horton Trust, this site is now under the jurisdiction of the estate." "You don't own this land, Thomas," Alfred said, stepping forward to block the path, his shoulders squared. Samuel stood right beside him, gripping a heavy wrench with white knuckles. "I don't need to own the dirt to own what's in it," Thomas snarled, storming closer. He peered over Alfred's shoulder, catching a glimpse of the subterranean bunker. His eyes widened comically. "Liquid assets. Anything of value buried here belongs to the primary estate. Grandfather clearly hid assets from the probate court. Sheriff, remove them from the premises. They are trespassing on an active financial investigation." Sheriff Miller hooked a thumb into his utility belt, looking uncomfortable but compliant. "Son, you're going to have to step aside. Mr. Sterling has already filed an emergency injunction with the county judge. Until the contents of that hole are catalogued, nobody goes in or out." Alfred felt the familiar, crushing weight of the establishment bearing down on him. They were trying to take it all away again. But as he felt the heavy brass corners of Silas's ledger pressing against his ribs, a cold, calculating calm washed over him. The mechanic from the wrong side of the tracks was about to dismantle the Horton machine. Tension hung heavy in the humid mountain air as Richard Caldwell, the estate lawyer, arrived at the ridge the following morning. Thomas and Beatrice had set up a veritable command center with pop-up tents and private security guards, completely cordoning off the backhoe and the crater. Alfred and Samuel had refused to leave the property, sitting by a campfire they had built near Alfred's beat-up truck. "This is a legally complex situation, Alfred," Caldwell said gently, approaching the fire with a briefcase in hand. Thomas and Beatrice flanked the older lawyer, both wearing expressions of smug victory. "It isn't complex at all, Richard," Beatrice sneered, adjusting her silk scarf. "Silas was suffering from dementia. He hid estate assets. Alfred here was trying to steal them. We are prepared to offer him a sum of $50,000 to walk away right now and drop any claims to the bunker's contents. $50,000 for a collection of cars worth $250 million? Alfred asked, poking the fire with a stick. Thomas flinched. How did you know the valuation? Because I read his letters, Alfred said, standing up. He reached into his truck and pulled out the heavy brass ledger, dropping it onto the hood of his truck with a resounding thud. Thomas scoffed. A book? You think a book overrides an emergency injunction? It does when it contains 50 years of federal crimes, Alfred replied, his voice deadly quiet. Silas didn't hide the cars to keep them from probate, Thomas. He hid them because they were the only things he bought legally. The Horton Trust, the Cayman accounts, the downtown high-rises. All of it was financed through illegal kickbacks, mob-connected construction loans, and embezzled steel union pensions. Beatrice's face drained of color. You're lying. You're a desperate, pathetic liar. Am I? Alfred flipped the ledger open. Page 42. A detailed account of the municipal bribe Silas paid to secure the waterfront zoning rights in 1988. The exact same waterfront rights you inherited, Thomas. Page 89. The transfer of illicit funds into the Cayman shell companies that Beatrice now controls. Caldwell adjusted his glasses, staring at the ledger with a mixture of professional horror and profound realization. Alfred, if those documents are authentic, it means the entirety of the primary estate is subject to federal RICO statutes, asset forfeiture. Exactly, Alfred said, his eyes locking onto his cousin. If you claim the contents of this vault belong to the Horton Trust, then you are acknowledging that the trust is tied to Silas. You claim the cars, you claim the crimes, and I will hand this ledger over to the FBI white-collar division today. The silence on the ridge was absolute. The wind whispered through the dead pine trees, carrying the scent of impending doom for the Sterling and Hayes families. You wouldn't dare, Thomas whispered, his bravado entirely evaporated. It would destroy the family name. I was never part of your family, Alfred reminded him coldly. Silas left me this land and the legal assets beneath it because he knew I had nothing to lose. You have everything to lose. Alfred reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter, handing it to Caldwell. The lawyer read it silently, his face turning pale. He slowly closed his briefcase. Beatrice. Thomas, Caldwell said, his voice trembling slightly. I strongly advise you to withdraw your injunction immediately. If the federal government audits the estate based on this ledger, you will not only lose your inheritances, but you may also face criminal prosecution for receiving stolen funds. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp. She looked at the crater, then at the ledger, and finally at Alfred. For the first time in her life, she saw him not as the grease-stained orphan, but as the executioner of her opulent lifestyle. Without a word, she turned and fled toward her luxury SUV. Thomas stood rooted to the spot, his fists clenched, staring at the dirt. The billions he had counted on, the empire he had planned to expand, it was all tainted, fragile, and entirely at the mercy of the cousin he had mercilessly mocked. Get off my land, Thomas, Alfred commanded, his voice echoing across the rocky terrain. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, Thomas turned and walked away. The private security guards, realizing who actually held the power, quickly packed up their equipment and followed suit. Within 6 months, the landscape of the Horton legacy was unrecognizable. True to his word, Alfred contacted Special Agent Gregory Donovan of the FBI, negotiating absolute immunity for himself in exchange for handing over Silas's ledgers. The federal government swiftly froze the Horton Trust. Beatrice and Thomas spent the remainder of their rapidly depleting fortunes on criminal defense attorneys, fighting federal indictments for tax evasion and possession of illicit assets. They lost the mansions, the high-rises, and their status in Pittsburgh society. As for Alfred, he did not keep all the cars. He auctioned the 1937 Mercedes-Benz for a staggering $19 million to a private museum in Switzerland. With the funds, he paid the back taxes on Dead Creek Ridge and hired the best engineering firms in the state to stabilize the land and restore the subterranean bunker. He didn't move into a penthouse or buy a yacht. Instead, he built a modest, state-of-the-art auto restoration garage right on top of the ridge. Big Jim Reynolds retired from his old shop to run the new facility as Alfred's head manager, and Samuel O'Connor was put on a hefty permanent retainer as the estate's chief historian. Alfred Horton, the outcast orphan, spent his days deep in the climate-controlled bunker, surrounded by the finest machines ever built by human hands. He had inherited a wasteland, but beneath the dirt and the mockery, he had unearthed his true legacy, not just a fortune in steel and chrome, but the ultimate enduring vindication. What an incredible journey of sweet revenge and hidden history. Alfred proved that true wealth isn't always what glitters on the surface, and karma has a funny way of balancing the scales. If you loved this story of the underdog coming out on top, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling, real-life mysteries and dramatic tales.